Please listen. I implore you not to cancel our wedding. After witnessing his expression, I realized that I may have acted a bit immaturely. However, it was disheartening to see my potential father-in-law belittling me while my boyfriend did nothing to support me. My patience was wearing thin with both my boyfriend and his father, who judged people solely based on their social status and brand affiliations. The anger within me reached its peak during our initial meeting, leading me to storm out. In our second meeting, he scorned me, scrutinizing my coat, until his expression suddenly changed upon noticing the brand tag. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Jessica Smith, a 28-year-old ground staff member at an airport. Although my parents live in Italy and run a fashion business, I reside alone in New York. It was there that I met Jacob Turner, my current boyfriend, at my favorite cafe, who is 2 years older than me. Jacob was a regular customer like myself, and as we spent more time together, his kind treatment won me over. I quickly fell in love with him, someone who managed to ignite a spark in me every day. Finally, after 2 years of dating, he proposed an idea. Hey Jessica, how about we have a marriage meeting at my parents' house next week? I was thrilled that he too was considering marriage, just like me. His father, much like mine, owned a prominent fashion brand. I appreciated his global presence, true to his status as the son of a brand president. He was always dressed in high-end clothing with a smile. I replied that I would love to attend the marriage meeting, but his tone turned somber as he added, "But my dad dislikes people who appear poor. Are you sure you'll be okay? I don't mean it in a bad way or that you're poor, but it's about your appearance." Although unintentional, his words felt condescending, as if he were looking down on me. Are you implying there's something wrong with how I look? I asked, taken aback. No, I think your uniqueness is wonderful, he reassured me, but deep down, I couldn't help but feel offended. I had gone out of my way to dress decently, ensuring that I looked worthy of being Jacob's girlfriend. Ever since we started dating, I began paying more attention to my fashion choices, even on my days off. I never skipped makeup, and I started taking a keen interest in my outfits, ranging from budget-friendly brands to high-end labels. I wanted to shine alongside Jacob, who effortlessly exuded a captivating aura. Undeniably, his best attribute was his looks. With his model-like physique, handsome face, and radiant presence, he could easily grace the pages of a fashion magazine. In terms of work, I earned a higher income and spoke multiple languages, putting me ahead in terms of capabilities. However, his occasional condescending remarks continued to bother me. Well, Jessica, you're pretty, so I think you'll be fine, but be prepared. My dad is strict. He cares about whether you're suitable for the Turner family, essentially whether you fit the brand image of my dad's company. He's extremely proud of his brand, and I don't think he'll forgive anyone who tarnishes it. I won't be able to defend you on the day, he explained, smiling at me. But to me, it only felt like mounting pressure. What did he mean by not being able to help me? It seemed like he was ready to abandon me without a second thought as the day of the marriage greeting approached. My unease grew when we arrived at his future and luxurious high-rise apartment in Las Vegas. I was stunned. What floor do they live on? I asked. The top floor, he replied casually, but from my perspective, it felt as if the ground beneath me had vanished. Unsurprisingly, upon researching, I discovered it was a super luxury apartment with a monthly rent of $7,000. The apartment boasted 4 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a well-designed kitchen layout. Its prime location was a 2-minute walk from the station. Justifying the high cost, I muttered to myself, I wonder if I'll be okay. Jacob, with a slightly tense expression, said, I don't know. It appeared that his father's approval meant more to him than his own girlfriend. With a sliver of unease, I stepped into the elevator beside him upon reaching their place. Jacob's mother welcomed us with her demeanor and the expense of the attire she wore. I could sense that the Turners were a special family, with my own parents running a business. I recognized immediately that everything she adorned was high-end. Her tone was cold and devoid of interest. As she uttered her welcome, She led me to the living room, where Jacob's father sat waiting. Jacob introduced me, and I nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Just as I was about to introduce myself, my father-in-law threw a question at me that furrowed my brow. "Jessica, how much did your entire outfit cost?" I hesitated for a moment. Ben replied that the coat is from the Gap and the skirt is from Zara, so in total, it's probably around 300 or so. Upon hearing my response, my father-in-law let out a heavy sigh and proceeded to berate Jacob. "Jacob, you brought this cheap-looking woman here. Are you trying to disgrace our family name?" I was shocked. I found myself in a state of disbelief. Not only did my father-in-law insult me by calling me cheap, but Jacob, instead of defending me, was desperately apologizing. It was in that moment that I realized I couldn't marry him. "That's enough. We're done here." My father-in-law dismissed me entirely. Jacob stood there dumbfounded, and so our engagement was called off, and we made our way back home as we walked side by side. Jacob began to grumble. "Didn't I tell you not to dress according to your own taste? Because of you, I was embarrassed in front of my parents. Why can't I even choose my own clothes when we get married? Are you going to dictate that I am only close to your dad's brand?" Overwhelmed with anger at my father-in-law's attitude and Jacob's lack of support, my tongue became harsh. It was then that Jacob, echoing my sentiments, started to get emotional too. "Yes, that's right. If you dress in his clothes, you'll shine. Please just listen to me for once, because you are doing whatever you want, even though our marriage is in danger." Fueled by frustration, I responded sharply, "Let's call off the marriage." Jacob, frozen in his tracks, taken aback by my firm response with a tense face, stuttered, "You're joking, right?" I met his gaze and replied firmly, "I'm serious." In that moment, all his previous confidence vanished, and he began repeatedly apologizing, begging for anything but calling off the wedding and observing his plea. I wondered if I had been too harsh, so for the time being, I decided to observe the situation a little longer. We agreed to revisit the marriage greeting a week later, with the father-in-law threatening to break off the engagement if things didn't go well. My thoughts aligned with his, and on the day of the second marriage meeting, Jacob seemed nervous from the morning. While I remained calm, however, there was one difference. My outfit, the clothing I wore, was all made in Italy, as requested by my father, who ran a brand overseas and also had a presence in the US. Sensing that the situation was not favorable, my dad had someone from his American branch deliver the clothes since Jacob was at work when they arrived. He had no idea about it as he looked at my new coat with a puzzled expression. He refrained from commenting due to the lack of time. Before our scheduled meeting on our way to his parents' house, he pleaded with me, saying, "Please, let's just make this meeting successful, okay? You want to marry me, don't you?" The expression on his face implied that I should feel honored to have the opportunity to marry him. However, deep down, my excitement about getting married had diminished, and trust had eroded too much due to everything that had happened. I concealed these feelings behind a false smile and replied, "I'll do my best." When we arrived at his parents' house, his father came to greet us. This time, my mother-in-law was absent as soon as we stepped into the house. My father-in-law began speaking. "Hey, Jacob, what's the meaning of this? Didn't you promise to dress her in my brand?" His pride in his brand was even greater than I had imagined. He once told me that even a pair of socks from his brand cost more than $200. Jacob, full of remorse, responded, "I'm sorry, Dad." Jessica insisted on choosing her outfit. My father-in-law let out a sigh and said, Jessica, could you please not destroy our family's brand image? I mean, wearing such a cheap-looking coat." He scrutinized my new coat closely as he spoke. "That's a knockoff, isn't it? At first glance, it looks like a Louis Vuitton, but it's not." He took out his phone and started searching for something, presumably checking the price. "I found it. There's a knockoff that looks just like your coat, and it's cheap too. Even if you don't wear our brand, there must be something a little better than that." My father-in-law ruthlessly picked apart my appearance. His behavior was outrageous, and it was clear that this was no longer a simple meet and greet for our marriage. Jacob, in front of his father, remained tense and did nothing to defend me. "Well, sit down and get that 60 coat off. You look poor." My father-in-law smirked. Apparently, there was a similar product to my coat priced at $60, but in reality, it was missing 3 zeros. At that point, I had reached the end of my patience. "I'm sorry, may I borrow a hanger?" I tried to reach a hanger nearby. That's when my father-in-law said, "For a cheap coat like that, a hanger is too good. There's a basket over there. Use that. Jacob, get it for her." He ordered Jacob to hand me a laundry basket. He was behaving like his father's puppet, not saying a word even when we made eye contact. However, he froze when he saw the label peeking out of my coat, which I reluctantly placed in the basket. It was then that my father-in-law said, "Oh, Jessica, why didn't you tell us earlier that you're wearing something quite impressive?" My father-in-law tried to force a smile on his face. I stared back at him coldly and spoke about that marriage thing. "Let's call it off, please." They both looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Jacob asked. "If it's only natural, even if he's your own father, if you can't stand up for your future wife when she's being bullied, I wouldn't want to welcome you as my husband." He looked down and stayed silent, not knowing what to say. "Also, father-in-law, this coat is from a brand my father runs." When I said, "Prada, it's a collaboration piece with Prada, and my father led the project. There are only 5 of these made in the world, and it costs $60,000. As if struck by lightning, my father-in-law's reaction was one of disbelief. I later learned that the most expensive coat from his brand cost around $12,000. Although that's considered high-end in general, it paled in comparison to mine. It made me realize that big brand CEOs judge people based on appearances. My father-in-law was speechless, and I took the opportunity to address both of them. "Jacob, don't you think you were getting a little too full of yourself just because you're the son of a CEO? Sure, you look good and wear nice things, but what's inside doesn't match up." Jacob tried to argue back, but from my perspective, his anger seemed ridiculous. "So you can justify leaving me alone to take all the bullying and even pressuring me to succeed the second time around? How would you feel if our roles were reversed?" "Well, I don't want to be hurt any more than I already am, just so you can save your pride." I said it sternly. Jacob became subdued and simply replied, "I'm sorry." Then Jacob turned to my father-in-law, and with a forced smile, my father-in-law said, "Of course I'll approve the marriage. I was wrong. Please calm down," still under the misconception that he held the upper hand. I was thoroughly disgusted by his behavior. I sighed deeply, causing my father-in-law to jolt in surprise. He nervously asked, "Do you know the ultra-luxurious Italian brand Ruby?" "Of course, they're one of the top brands worldwide." "I know the CEO," he replied. I continued, "My coat is from Ruby. It's a collaboration with Prada." "You're joking." Both of them stared at me wide-eyed, their mouths opening and closing, unable to speak. I could tell they were struggling. "I wanted to tell you formally when we announced our engagement, but that didn't seem appropriate given the circumstances, so I'd been disrespecting the daughter of a more prestigious brand this whole time." "It seems so, Dad." "Jacob, quit messing around. How did you not know this beforehand?" "Thanks to you. We've made fools of ourselves." My father-in-law realized he was feeling cornered. My father-in-law began to blame his son, revealing the company's precarious financial situation. It turned out that my father-in-law's company was barely managing to stay profitable, and an acquisition would put them in a dire position. My father always follows through on his promises, and he raised me to do the same. As I've already said, I won't be married. "Jessica, I'm sorry," Jacob said, with tears in his eyes. I barely gave him a glance. I had never thought that the man I once thought was cool could make such a pathetic face. My father-in-law also apologized and begged me to reconsider. However, I firmly stated that's up to my father. When all hope was lost, my father-in-law turned pale and fell to his knees, ignoring the two despairing men. I left my father-in-law's house after that day. I lost all contact with Jacob. When I reported back to my father, he informed me that the acquisition was already underway. My father had always been a gentle and kind man who treated everyone equally, but when he found out that his little girl had been hurt, he became a different person. He had always had his eye on acquiring my ex-father-in-law's company, waiting for the right time. The moment he learned that the man who had looked down on me for being poor was the CEO of the company he was considering acquiring, his decision was made. All doubt had vanished in the acquisition. My father promised to secure the conditions of all employees except for the CEO. This meant that my ex-father-in-law's fate was entirely in my father's hands. As for what happened to those two afterward, I have no idea. However, I felt a sense of relief when I saw the breaking news on TV reporting that Ruby Corp, a big American fashion brand, had acquired a leading fashion brand. The news interviewed my ex-father-in-law during the acquisition. He looked utterly worn out, the spark gone from his eyes. My ex-father-in-law and ex-boyfriend, who both prioritized status above all else in marriage, were likely unable to appreciate a person's inner value. I strongly believe that a CEO should be like my father, someone who doesn't judge solely by appearances but carefully evaluates personality. I learned a deep lesson this time, one that applies not only to branded goods but to all things in life.